Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I am delighted to welcome you to this May seminar in our Great Books series. Today, we want to focus on one of the great gurus coming out of India, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, known later in his life as Osho, and more popularly now. And to talk about Osho and to look at one of his books on Tantra, we're very privileged, actually, to have Raffaelo Manacorda, who's one of our own graduate students, who is one of the best and the brightest in our wisdom school here at Ubiquity University, doing a fascinating dissertation and has a deep insight because of the work that he does as a psychotherapist and spiritual director and seeker into the works of Osho. So Raffaelo is going to share both this month and in June his perceptions of Osho's work on Tantra. So Raffaelo, welcome very heartily to our Great Books program, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. It's really quite an honor for me, and I'm delighted to be here with you in this series, in the Great Book series, which is one of my favorite programs in Ubiquity University. And because there are books, and those are the great books, where you can really establish an intimate relationship with, right? It's not just like reading something. There are books that touch us, touch our soul in a very deep way. And the Book of Secrets was one of those for me, definitely. It changed my life. I first approached it about 12 years ago. And so I'm excited to share with you this experience, really, this deep experience of connecting through a book to the living transmission of a human being, in this case, Osho. And I want to start by saying that this presentation, you might know a few things about Osho, you might know a lot, but this presentation in the spirit of Osho might maybe challenge some of your beliefs and ideas around spirituality and around enlightenment and all such things. And somehow I feel that this is to be expected, as the character that Osho was so deeply spiritually controversial. And we will see why in the course of the presentation. So I'll just be very, very succinct in terms of Osho's or Rajneesh's biography. You can find that sourced everywhere on the internet. But what I do want to point out is that although we are now perhaps used to see Osho as an Indian spiritual guru, it's like the archetype of a bearded man that sits while the disciples are coming to him sometimes to get a darshana, to have their names changed, etc. So it fits very well in that model. However, really, Osho, in his biography, he was more a professor of philosophy. That's what he was for a few decades before stepping into more the spiritual teachings. And so he held a master's degree in philosophy, and he taught philosophy at the university for quite a while. And even before that, he was a very keen political commentator. He used to be very, very interested in communism and socialism until he wasn't, which is kind of like something that happened often in the life of Osho. He would just dive deep into a subject and then discard it and move over. He was a very fervent critic of Gandhi, just to give you this anecdotal information. So he used to be very interested in politics, and for a brief amount of time, he flirted with Indian nationalism, but then he moved on. But I would say that the philosopher in Osho is very present. By the way, this is also one of the strands that I feel personally connect me to Osho, as I'm also an MA in philosophy. And somehow I would say that Osho was a philosopher of the purest kind, although he bitterly criticized philosophy in his latest years, as many other things, because he was interested, existentially, I would say, interested in the essence of philosophy, in the essence of the questioning, of asking questions about everything and anything. So he was famous for being a very hard student to have in the class, because he would just like question everything that was presented. Of course, we now approach Osho from a different angle, which is as a spiritual teacher. But I will say that my angle, the angle that I'm going to offer to you, is more the angle of a practitioner as opposed to the angle of a scholar. So although this presentation will focus on Osho and Tantra, because the book that we are exploring is somehow Osho's biggest contribution to the field of Tantra, nevertheless, many scholars of Tantra and scholars of Sanskrit would consider probably Osho's writings, I will clarify that, as not entirely even accurate. It doesn't matter so much from our standpoint right now, because what he was and what he encouraged people to do as well was more the practice of certain spiritual techniques and methods that in his opinion would open the door to access the totality of reality, the totality of being. So it's important to finally also remark that actually Osho himself didn't write any books, none, zero. All the books that we have from Osho are actually transcripts of his oral teachings. And in some way, this is a very accurate representation, I would say, of the way that Osho loved to transmit his knowledge and his being more than his knowledge. Someone in one of the talks that Osho did remarked that he had fallen into a contradiction, that he had said something and then there was another question and the next answer seemed to be in contradiction with the previous one. And he answered, quite joyously, of course I said two opposite things, because the questions came from different people and the questions came at a different moment. So he basically would say something to the tone of, my answer arises in the moment when the question arises. The two are part of a process that is alive. So he was absolutely against making a doctrine or a standard or even a codified version of anything that he taught, really. Obviously, the human nature, is different from that. And nowadays we have all kinds of Osho centers and Osho, books, of course. And you could say that we may be very tempted to speak about the Osho spirituality, but from his transmission, that would not be correct, because for him, the spiritual transmission needs to be alive. So that said, I'll do my best to filter that through my own being, of course, and particularly focusing on this masterpiece of a book that I have here by my side. I wanted to show it to you all so that you can also have a look at the size and the consistency of this book, which is about 1,300 pages in length. And however, it was for me an extremely fluid book to read, because for what I shared right a minute ago, reading a book by Osho is actually more like listening to Osho speak and entering into an alive conversation. So the Book of Secrets by Osho is, in some way, you could say, Osho's commentary on a very sacred and classical tantric text, particularly from the Kashmiri Shaivistic tradition. The text is called the Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra. And this text is a very succinct text written in sutras that contains 112 stanzas or sutras, to be more precise, that basically describe meditation techniques. We will clarify this much better. But Osho based his commentary of the Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra on another book, which some of you may have read. I actually haven't read it yet. It's on my wish list, which is Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. This is a book on Zen, that contains a translation of the Vijnana and Bhairava Tantra at the end. And again, from a purely scholarly standpoint, some of the translations of the Vijnana and Bhairava Tantra that you will find in the Book of Secrets might be questionable. They might be seen as not entirely accurate. However, the alive transmission that they give is, to my feeling and to my understanding, extremely potent. And this also goes hand in hand with the feelings and the vision that Osho had about Tantra. So let's dive right into that and see what he had to say about Tantra and what Tantra was for him, and why for him Tantra was the domain not of the scholar but of the practitioner. And this will be clear by just going to the very first verses of the Vijnana and Bhairava Tantra as interpreted by Osho in the Book of Secrets. So I'm just going to read these few short verses that open the whole treatise. Devi asks, "O Shiva, what is your reality? What is this wonder-filled universe? What constitutes seed? Who centers the universal wheel? What is this life beyond form, pervading forms? How may we enter it fully, above space and time, names and descriptions? Let my doubts be cleared." So the Book of Secrets and the Vijnana and Bhairava Tantra as well open with a pledge. But not just the pledge of the spiritual disciple to their teacher. No, this is an intimate conversation, and Osho will be very, very clear on stressing this point. This is the conversation between Devi and Shiva, or in other words, between the feminine principle and the masculine principle embodied, as is typical in Indian spirituality, embodied in personified beings. But these are two lovers. These are two lovers engaged in an intimate conversation, the kind of conversation that you could have while looking at a starry sky in a perfect night and with your lover by your side, perhaps even after lovemaking, in those moments of intimacy when everything feels like so open. And then one of the two, Devi, asks to the other one to help her dispel her doubts. And her doubts are about everything. Let me just quickly read this again, or just highlight some of the words, because Devi's questions are basically about the nature of reality. What is your reality? What constitutes seed? Or in other words, what is the origin? What is the prima causa of everything? That's the the scope of Devi's questions. And there, you can feel an urgency in these questions. They're not just like philosophical speculations. Oh, let's talk about whether there is an ultimate cause for everything or not. No, she's like, tell me. And then the last line is very, very relevant and somehow telling, because after having asked all these questions, Devi says, "Let my doubts be cleared." So the last invitation, almost injunction from Devi, is not about, oh, please give me an explanation of, everything that I ask for, give me answers. She's not asking for answers, really. She's asking for a transformation of consciousness in her. She's asking for her state of mind, if we use the word mind as indicative of, in the higher sense, so to speak. We're not talking about the practical mind or the lower mind, but mind as inner awareness. She's asking for that to be changed. Just as you could, wish that the clouded, overcast sky opens. So this is not a request for answers so much as it is a request for spiritual transmission that will provoke a shift. So from this, we already see some very, very specific peculiarities of Tantra as Osho understood it. First of all, there is a genderization. And this is very typical of Tantra, where sexuality and gender are representative of something beyond that. We could say, following Osho's interpretation, that here the one who is asking is the feminine principle in all of us, and it's personified by a female speaker. And the feminine principle, according to Osho, was in us was the one that is better suited to understand Tantra and to practice Tantra, maybe even more to practice than to understand, because only by dropping into receptivity and our womb-like capacity to absorb, receive, be touched, be changed, only then can we access the potency of Tantra. And what happens then if we don't have access to our receptivity and instead we are of the opposite kind, more outgoing, directive, disciplined, which would be more the qualities associated with the masculine principle? Then Osho would say, well, then maybe Tantra is not so much the right path for you, but perhaps yoga is. So quite provocatively for some, Osho interpreted yoga as the path of discipline. So disciplining one's body, one's mind, one's feelings, one's sexual desires and other kinds of desires, whereas he saw Tantra as the path of ultimate surrender and acceptance. What will happen if I accept fully everything in me and around me? And according to Osho, that would be, and actually that is part of the meditations contained in this book, that would be one of the ways, one of the techniques where you can realize. So in the Book of Secrets, Osho presents these two as separate paths, the path of yoga and the path of Tantra. But for example, I myself have definitely walked both and somehow had my feet in both for more than 15 years now. So for everybody who's listening, it's not, to have you choose one or the other, but to understand why Osho gives so much importance to the fact that it is Devi asking. And it is Devi to initiate the conversation, because she's the one who is in a receptive state. She's the one who is ready to be touched and to be changed. Also, in the commentary to the introduction that we just read, which follows the lines, the stanzas, Osho sets down some very, very important principles around Tantra that are the base in his way for understanding what this book is, what Tantra is, and how this book needs to be read. And these principles may sound quite confronting to some, quite sort of like weird or surprising, or even in some way spiritually shocking. The first one is that he will say very clearly, Tantra is science. Tantra is not religion. Tantra is not even spirituality. Tantra is science. And what he means, what Osho means by saying Tantra is science, is somehow, in my feeling, even more clarified if we use a slightly different word to specify even better and say that Tantra is a technology. And that the meditations contained in this book, which for Osho was like the pinnacle basically of Tantric lore, are techniques. They're not answers. They're not expressions of a revealed truth. They're not the truth. They are techniques to taste the truth. And this both limits, if you will, the scope of what we're about to enter into together, but by focusing it and by eliminating any possibility of misunderstanding that, that we could approach this as we approach, say, the Bible or the Quran. He says, no, forget about that. This is a technical book. This is a technological book. This is a series of techniques, some of them dealing with the body, some of them dealing with the breath, some of them dealing with awareness, that you just need to follow. This is the ultimate, or the epitome, if you will, of declaring that what we have here is not the moon, it's the finger pointing at the moon, or actually it's 112 fingers so that you can pick and choose the one that works best for you. But this is what this book is, and according to Osho, this is what Tantra is. So don't confuse Tantra with a religion. Don't confuse Tantra with a revealed, unfolded, revealed truth as other religions claim to have. This is practical. And the direct consequence of that, if you wish, of this first principle, which may be very confronting for people to hear, and Osho spelled it very clearly, is that Tantra is amoral. Tantra is not immoral. Tantra is not moral, but Tantra is amoral. So Osho says, look, what you have in this book is like a medicine, right? Like a medicine for an illness. Do you think that a medicine would, before healing someone, would consider whether the person to be healed, is ethically sound and whether they're morally acceptable? No, medicine is a medicine. A medicine will cure a thief, a medicine will cure a saint. And, by definition, it doesn't take a stance into whether it's good or bad to heal someone. It just does it. End of the story. And this is Tantra for Osho as well. So I feel that somehow, I just want to make a short excursus here, somehow a lot of the controversy that happened around Osho, especially in the later years when he moved to the United States and created a residential ashram and community in Oregon there, and almost immediately all kinds of scandals and controversy, like big scale controversy, happened. I would say that part of that is because of the incapacity of the general public and the general state of ordinary human consciousness to really understand what I just shared with you. Can we hold something to be of the highest spiritual value and at the same time amoral? Well, for those of us who have been born and bred in Christianity, or modern Christianity, where the intertwining of spirituality as filtered by religion and morals is so strong, like almost like you can't imagine one without the other, then this is a very radical statement. And when I read this book 13 years ago, I can remember as if it was yesterday, this was one of the first little drops of poison, and I will say this in a celebratory way, of beautiful spiritual poison that this book injected into me. And that poison started to help me dissolve some of the fixed ideas or prejudices that I had, and not without pain, and then create more spaciousness and more freedom for me to experience. So, well, if Tantra is amoral, then what is the purpose of it? What is the, if it's not to make us a better person or to guide us towards, the highest good or something like that, then what is the purpose of Tantra according to Osho? The purpose of Tantra is something that cannot be very easily described in words, but it can be experienced. And in today's spiritual philosophical parlance, we could definitely say that the aim, the goal, the direction that Tantra is taking us is the direction of experiencing and abiding in a state of non-duality. Osho would also very often use the wording a state of no mind, of mindlessness. But here, when we say no mind, yes, we are talking about the practical, concrete mind, the mind that divides, evaluates, works in pairs of opposites. So for him, accessing a state beyond those definitions, those labels, was the goal, and somehow also the seed, the source of Tantra. So it's almost like no one can really describe what we are talking about, but these are the ways that you can taste it and experience it. And this is very easy to see in many of the sutras that will come, because you will notice when I read some of the other techniques that they almost seem to stop. The description happens and then there is a stop. And the stop is exactly because we cannot expect Tantra to describe to us the result that it's going to take us to, because that would be a violation of its own principle. And this is somehow what Devi asks for, this touching of a non-dual state, when she says, how may we enter fully this state or this life? Actually, the word that is used is life, that is above space and times, but especially beyond or above names and descriptions, which in other words means beyond any way in which we can categorize reality, try to make sense of it, whether it's our inner reality or the world surrounding us, beyond individual existences, beyond. Basically, we could stop here and say beyond everything that my words can say. Osho believed that the 112 meditations contained in the Vijnana Tantra, in the Book of Secrets now, are enough. That with one of those or two of those or three of those, there is enough and nothing else needs to be added. So he said it very clearly. Start with one, start playing with one for a few days or weeks, then try another one. And once you find the one that works for you, just keep going. And you will, and I'll stop here, you will access the ultimate reality. Although these words are as well very imperfect. So for the next few minutes, and then in the second encounter that we have, I'm going to present some of these meditations, not all of them, 112 is many. So I just chose a few, but also right now in the chat or perhaps in between the two encounters, I would love it if you let me know where would you like to go, because there is really a meditation for everything, from meditations that teach us how to work with our desires and with our emotions, to others that, or to use them as a doorway, to other meditations that are really about the body and how to, through the body, access the ultimate reality, to others that are more philosophical in nature. Generally speaking, I would say they are presented in an order that, generally speaking, goes from the more gross, as in having to do with body and breath and different kinds of energies and matter, to the more subtle towards the end. But it's not always the case. There's some exceptions. So one of my favorite techniques expounded in the Book of Secrets, one that touched me very, very deeply, has to do exactly with emotions. So I'll start from that one, although there are many that are very interesting. This is the 24th meditation, and on the paper version of the book, you will find it at page 237 and following. So the sutra reads, when a mood against someone or for someone arises, do not place it on the person in question, but remain centered. When a mood against someone or for someone else, when a mood against someone or for someone arises, do not place it on the person in question, but remain centered. Wait a moment. This could sound like, just very simple, good human being advice, like don't get too mad, don't get too angry, stay centered. Is that what Osho is trying to convey? No. Remember, each one of these is a meditation, which means it is a technique that can have us access the ultimate state. So what the Vijnana Tantra and Osho is saying in this moment is, hey, when you get angry at someone, well, that's potentially a doorway to the absolute. Did you know that? Did you ever consider that? This is such, it's not surprising from this standpoint that Osho and Tantra have not been so far very popular in the wider spiritual universe as we know it. Because if someone tells us that our anger, for instance, is a potential doorway to the absolute, doesn't that invite us to be more angry? Or, to just let our emotions loose and be carried away by them? It may appear so superficially, but as you will see, it is not the case. Tantra sees emotions as a powerful manifestation of energy. Simple, so far so good. And what this sutra is telling us is, okay, you get angry at someone. And by the way, you could substitute angry with any other strong emotion that you wish to use. Angry at someone, excited with someone, grateful to someone, doesn't matter. Let's just stick with anger. I get angry at someone, that is an emotional stream. And that stream has a direction, like every stream, like a river, right? That stream is going from somewhere to somewhere. And the easiest thing to notice is where it is going to. And that's what we always do. I'm angry at you. So somehow the habitual thing that we do is that we fix our attention on the destination of the river we are angry with in the example of anger. Like many other techniques contained here, this one is a pattern, a powerful pattern interrupt. Osho says, okay, you're angry, great. Now turn your attention to the source of the river. Follow the river upstream. Follow that energy upstream. Follow that anger, that desire upstream. Where does it come from? And by, just like a salmon fish, by following the river upstream, eventually you will get to the source. And that's all. That's all you need to do. So, of course, there's many other ways that you can get to the source, and any moment is a good moment, really. But somehow, for some people, for some temperaments, and for some phases of our life, a strong emotion is one of the best access points. Just follow it back. There is this story quoted by Osho of a Zen master who was very fond of finding peace by going on a small boat in the middle of a very quiet lake. And then he would close his eyes and just meditate or be quiet, just be in peace. And one night, as he was in the boat with his eyes closed, another boat violently hit the boat that he was in. And, he opened his eye and immediately got angry at the person who was in the other boat. Just that when he looked, he saw that the boat was empty. The boat that had hit his own boat was empty. So all of that anger in a split second, and that's what's beautiful about the story, like he opened his eyes ready to follow the course of anger, but there was nowhere to go, right? Because the boat was empty. And the empty boat continued downstream, and the Zen master, who at that time probably wasn't yet a master, but more like a practitioner, had a moment of full presence, and you could say of enlightenment, by just feeling fully the anger. The anger had nowhere to go, so that it had turned on itself, and by following that stream upwards, something opened. And from then onwards, he took that as a practice and almost as a pillar of his own spiritual practice. And every time he would notice an emotion, strong emotion arising towards someone, he would say to himself, that boat is also empty. All the boats are empty. So why don't I just stay with the feeling and turn inwards? So that's, a very powerful spiritual seed and root to understand why today, even in the more diluted versions of Neo-Tantra that are more accessible to the general population and still somehow valid and important that they exist, we give space to emotions. right? Not just because repressing emotion has all kinds of psychological costs that we can speak about, but also because they are a doorway. And this meditation just leaves that in a very clear, kind of black and white way. I was saying before how many of the techniques that you will find in the Book of Secrets feel like interrupts. You know, it's like opening a process and then stopping it. And there is something extremely powerful in the stopping of anything really, but particularly in the stopping of certain things. So I want to share with you the contents of meditation 25 and 26. Let's start with 25. Couldn't be clearer. So the meditation 25 says, just as you have the impulse to do anything, stop. Simple. Just as you have the impulse to do something, stop. Gurdjieff, great spiritual teacher from the early 20th century, was very fond of this particular kind of meditations, and he used to use them in his teachings and kind of perfect them. So he would have, for example, his students run about, you know, in all kind of movements, and then he would ring a bell or yell, stop. And you had to stop immediately, because in that moment, an opening for a realization could happen. So what is so powerful about stopping? And notice that the meditation, the technique is not go to a cave and don't do anything for 2 years and just lie in contemplation, and then you will be entering the ultimate reality. No, no, no. The documentation, the technique is meant for people that are doing things all the time, people that are immersed in the flux of life. But it just says, when you feel the impulse to do something, stop. So one of the vocabularies that Osho loved to use in his teachings was the center, finding the center or feeling the center. And although on a deeper non-dual level, there is no center, or the center is everywhere, more correctly, actually, in the very often divided state that we inhabit in body and mind, there needs to be some kind of forceful action, or something needs to happen for us to drop back into the center. And interrupting an action can do that for us. Another way, interestingly enough, that Osho considered that many people perhaps unconsciously seek that return to the center is by engaging in dangerous, extreme activities. You know, there are people in the world, extremely intelligent and sensitive people, who have this passion for life-threatening sports. You know, I was just reading today about this German guy, I don't remember his name now, and what he does is he goes around in the world chasing the highest possible wave to surf them. But it has to be, and he was declaring that in an interview, it has to be a life or death situation for him to be able to do it. He has to know that he could die any moment. Why is that? And Osho's answer would be, because in these states of danger, well, you need to be fully present. You need to be in the present moment. There is no future anymore. There is nothing really anymore except for the present moment. And the feeling can become almost addictive. And so here, Osho and the teaching on Bhairava Tantra is saying, well, you know, you don't need to climb the Yosemite stone wall free without ropes or surf the highest wave to feel that. You just need to stop. You just need to start doing something, and as you're about to start, stop. And that moment will create a moment of awareness, a moment of presence that then you can carry with you, and somehow continuing to do that again and again, reach a state of presence that is the doorway to the absolute. Another version of that is same thing, but in a different, from a different angle, is this one. When some desire comes, consider it, then suddenly quit it. I love this one. This one has been actually one of the ones that I've worked with the most. It has so many implications and ramifications. So Osho is saying, first of all, Osho is not saying renounce desires. Desires are bad. No, forget about that. Have desires. Now, when some desire comes, don't repress it. Don't repress it. Don't say, oh gosh, I had a desire for a chocolate cake. I have this every day. I know it's not good for me. Let me park it. That's valid. It's a valid course of action, but it is not the tantric course of action. Tantric course of action would be, okay, let me consider this desire. Let me consider here means let me put this desire at the center of my awareness. What happens when I embrace my desire for chocolate cake or for a cigarette or for sex, whatever, fill in the blank? When I put my whole attention on it, make it the object of my contemplation, my consideration, and then suddenly, and this is a very important part of the sutra, suddenly, not gradually, not in steps, suddenly I quit it. I renounce that desire. So I take it, I consider it, I even smell it, feel it, dwell in it, and then suddenly I quit it. Again, according to Osho, what would happen then is that a doorway would open into a state that we can call presence, we can call abiding into life, the stream of life itself, without consideration, without opinions about it, but being one with life. So desire is a doorway to life, as long as we're willing to use it and play with it as a spiritual meditation and as an embodied spiritual meditation. This particular Tantra, this particular meditation has many, many consequences, as you can imagine, and it is also what attracted, in my feeling, a lot of the criticism towards Osho and towards Tantra in general. Because if we are willing to work with our desires in this way, then we are all of a sudden situating these teachings in a very different camp, spiritual camp, from most of the standardized and organized spiritual lineages and religions, which would very often warn us against the temptation of desires and lead us or accompany us towards making our life more and more aesthetic, more and more devoid of those desires. Now you might say, wait a minute, but he's saying to consider it and then quit it. Doesn't that mean renouncing to desires? It may or it may not, but you will see in other meditations that we will maybe address in next meeting that actually some of these pathways have to do with quite the opposite, with letting go into that desire, letting go into that experience. So I'm going to share another one last meditation with you, and then just pause for a minute and see if there are any comments or questions about what was shared. And this is the meditation number 32. It has to do, so we're moving now from the more gross, so to speak, techniques that have to do with emotions, with desires, to something slightly more subtle, techniques that have to do with the eyes and vision. See as if for the first time a beauteous person or an ordinary object. See as if for the first time a beauteous person or an ordinary object. Once again, every time you read or listen to one of these sutras, you need to remember that even just one of them is enough to reach the ultimate. So again, what's being said here is like, oh, you want to abide in the non-dual and be immersed in the true nature of reality? Well, great. All you need to do is look upon anything really. It could be a beautiful person that you find attractive and mesmerizing, or it could be an ordinary object. It could be, the glass of water that I have in front of me. But there is a catch. You need to see it as if for the first time. Not easy, right? Easier said than done, because the moment we open our eyes and see something, almost immediately labels, definitions, memories, all kinds of patterns that we have associated with that object come up, fill our inner awareness, and then the opportunity is lost, Osho would say. So how do we do it? How do we get ourselves to see something for the first time? Well, we've all been able to do that as we were babies. That state of presence, that state of like activated merging with life, where there is no subject and no object, but there is an act of seeing and an act of looking, is something that we have all experienced in infancy. And just hanging around a little baby is a beautiful embodied reminder of how that is like. But again, Osho is saying, well, if you could manage to do that, even just one time, but fully, then the subject and the object would disappear. You would feel at one with the flux of existence. Actually, you would be the flux of existence itself, and then it's done. Nothing more to do. There is no other enlightenment beyond this. This is it. This is the state that Indian philosophy, or some strands of Indian philosophy and spirituality, would call samadhi, absorption into sameness, the solution of the subject and the object being at one with life. And all you need to do for that is to look upon an object or a person as if for the first time. Isn't that incredible? So there's more, there's so much more. There are meditation techniques that have to do with the breath. Those are actually very, very interesting. Meditation techniques that have to do with darkness, and it is one of the most amazing things in this book that because we are so used to associating spirituality with light, that actually in the Book of Secrets you will find some very important spiritual transmission about darkness. And why darkness, whether it is just like being in the dark in a starless night, moonless night, or in a dark room, or closing your eyes and going into inner darkness, although according to Osho that was a more difficult path, but how just being in darkness is an opening, can represent an opening for a state of ultimate presence, and again, oneness with life. So it is a very subversive thing to say when we are somehow so addicted to associating everything good and everything desirable with light, and to be very scared of darkness. And Osho will give some explanations of why that is, and why actually in a very deep sense, darkness is more primordial, if that even can be a grammatical construct. I was about to say more eternal, but obviously nothing can be more eternal. But why darkness is eternal, and it carries the vibration of eternity in it, and an absoluteness in a way more potent way than light can ever do. So anyway, I'm going to drop that maybe as a possible continuation for our next meeting, where I would like to go more into some of these techniques and look at some of those that work with sexuality and with the breath, and the ones that also work with darkness. So this is really, just to conclude, when I look at this book, like even right now in the moment, I actually would say this is not a book, at least not in the way that most people understand the word books. This is an object that somehow manages to contain an alive stream of consciousness, inspiration, and somehow something else, and a live stream of energy that, if you allow yourself to be entered by it and to be touched by it, may actually change your life. And what I mean by that is that it may change the way that you perceive you, the way that you perceive reality, and the way that you perceive the relationship between the two. So in the very deepest sense of the word, I would say that a book like that can be considered a great book, with all respect to the other millions of interesting books that have been written and will ever be written, but it is not so common to hold between our hands an object that, when allowed it to do so, can almost inject a virus in us, a good, healthy, if you will, virus that will start working its way through all the different layers of our inner worlds, and before you know it, it will create a state of spaciousness and emptiness inside that is just a marvelous thing. So I'm very excited for those of you who decided to attend this seminar, because either you've read it or maybe you are intending to read it. And for me, this book can provide an experience and a communion that is of the highest level. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening. I'll pass it back to you, Jim, for your comments, and then maybe we can open to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raffaello. And I want to encourage all of our students here to raise their hands and engage in this conversation, because when you're talking about Tantra, you're talking about the fires of inner revolution at every level, which is one of the reasons why many traditions negate it, because of its fiery potential for anarchy of the spirit. And I wanted to start with that. And then, I see Jan Jung has joined. So I'll promote you to a panelist, Jan Jung, and allow you to talk. But while you're thinking of your question, Jan Jung, I just want to start the conversation, Raffaello, by having you comment on this aspect of Tantra, that most mystical traditions, the Buddhist tradition, for example, in its early stages, negated the body and the appetites and the passions, because they understood the fiery nature of entering into those maelstroms, and how that could cause a radical destabilization of mind and psyche. And so Tantra developed, as you know, as a very small marginal stream at first, nearly 1,000 years after the Buddha, as people began to think, well, as you say, where does that anger come from? Maybe it's worth delving into it rather than repressing it. So I wonder if you could just start the discussion by your own reflections about the fiery nature of Tantra, and why most of the Orthodox traditions have very firmly squelched it.
Yeah, very good point, Jim. And I agree with you. And somehow, my personal interpretation of this reality, historical reality, that, you could almost say the Orthodox traditions are Orthodox because they did that. And that is what has been passed on as the orthodoxy, because there have been streams of, I'll take a liberty here to say tantric Buddhism, tantric Christianity, tantric Islam, just that they never were the majority or the orthodox, version of that spiritual stream that was passed on to us. Why is that? And for me, one of the most satisfying answers that I found for my personal investigation was actually through the work of Anne Baring in Ubiquity, when she explains how somehow this phase of disembodiment, right, this phase where consciousness violently struggles to separate itself from the matrix of instincts, sexuality, emotions, body, and nature, was a phase, and called that the solar era, the solar phase. That was a phase that, right or wrong, is not for us to say. We can't go back and do it differently, but somehow it was a phase that happened in the development of a self-reflective human, well, of a self-reflective consciousness. There seemed to be the need for this extrapolation of consciousness from that matrix. But with that, there also came an excess. And the excess is, or what we now can perceive as an excess. And the excess is the equation of the body, emotions, nature, ultimately as well. And we could say, with a tantric jargon, of the feminine, I'm using this term in a very, very broad sense here, the equation of that with dangerous temptation, and with something that needed to be kept at bay at best, if not outright destroyed, mortified, even vilified, right? I will say, even if we read Shantideva, beautiful expression of Mahayana Buddhism, where the way that the body is spoken to or spoken as is basically, this is a bag of filth. That just like, let it go. Don't focus your attention on that. As jarring as this can sound to our modern sensitivity, that was perhaps a necessary, albeit painful, step and phase, because, and I will conclude by saying this, and because this is the trap that we can fall into when we approach Tantra. So Tantra, or any form of embodied spirituality right now, cannot be an invitation to fall back into a consciousless identification with nature and primal, into a primal state.
Good point.
Because that's exactly what we've worked so hard and with so much pain to evolve beyond. So now, in Hegelian terms, we could say is, okay, thesis, antithesis, now is the time for synthesis. Or more following more Ken Wilber, we could say, don't ever make the mistake of confusing what is pre-rational with what is trans-rational. So the operation that consciousness did in all these centuries of having to separate from the instincts and the emotions and the body and nature is now perhaps starting to come full circle, where we can approach and identify again and be and feel again as a complete human, but not by falling back into primal, but rather by transcending the state of consciousness that we are at and embracing again the body, the emotion, sexuality, nature, all of this with an expanded and enlightened consciousness. So that's the best answer I can give to the point you made.
It's a great answer. Yanjun, what would you have to say about this weighty matter of Tantra?
Oh, it's so beautiful. Thank you. Okay, I wanted to share just one, because when you started this course, I have one friend, a dear friend in our community. She is one disciple of Osho. Now she's in her 80s, and she followed Osho in India with her family. She has two kids. Her kids grew up in the community of Osho's in India, and I don't know if you heard, they separated the parents and with their kids in their community. And she also followed Osho in Oregon there, and she lived the disciple life with others all the time for many years. So I want to say, so I haven't known her for 1 year. She's very, very loving, so beautiful person. She always, consider Osho is her master. So he met our sheikh in Denver, but they, Sheikh invited her here many years ago. Then a year after the Oregon case happened, so she had lived here for many years. Yes, very beautiful person. I wanted to say the teaching through her, your feeling. So she's full with wisdom. I feel for the teaching, how it works. It's say, if the people they are learning, they tend to a very beautiful human being. I feel that's a good teaching. She mentioned, thank you. She mentioned, mentioned this course. In fact, I think I did not arrange well. I think she likes to attend. She mentioned that she has so many Osho's tips, and I wanted to get rid of. Tips.
Thank you, Yanjun. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have a similar experience. One of my dearest colleagues that I work with on a daily basis as well, an Osho Sannyasin from those times, lived in Pune and then in Oregon. And I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. There is for those who had the good fortune of receiving that live transmission from Osho, there is a certain quality that you expressed, as being just a good person. And I would add to that, I always feel a certain quality of a Zen-like elegance in whatever they do, whether it's like, creating, I don't know, opening a restaurant or whatever they do. There is this quality of simplicity and elegance, which to me speaks about, it only happens when a person has found a degree of inner silence, and then their movements, their words come from this place of inner silence. And while I haven't had the fortune of meeting Osho, actually, when I realized that Osho had long been dead, I was so sad. I had a moment of real spiritual sorrow for myself. I felt so unfortunate, but because of what you're saying, because his transmission was not so much the creation of a system and of a series of steps and of a series of concepts, but an alive transmission, then the beauty of that is that we can still receive it from those that have been in contact. Not so much through the words, perhaps, but through just their actions and their way of carrying themselves. So I full agree with what you said, and I am so happy that I could manifest some of those people in my own life. And at the same time, I am curious to see, and at times, I may notice how there seems to be an almost inevitable human tendency to then everything that's so beautiful and alive, turn it into a sterile, dead, repetitive kind of thing. Like we could say, of course, the same for Christianity. I mean, I'm sure that Christianity in its first century or so was such an alive transmission. And then when now we are faced with the structured forms of Christianity, they may at times feel lifeless. And so there is a curiosity in me, a spiritual curiosity, will Osho's transmission manage to stay alive, or will it again become codified? And I think he had this concern as well, because in just quite shortly before dying, he did something, he did many radical things, but one of the radical things that he did is that he ordered all the sannyasin to gather all his books in the community and then the orange robes and burn it all. So at least the way that I interpret that was his way to say, hey, when I'm gone, don't you dare create Oshoism. Don't you dare turn what I share with you into the next whatever spiritual path. And the question is, can we do that? Can we refrain from that? Are we able to not do that? It's a very powerful question for me.
It's just bringing to mind. Thank you so much, Yanjun, because you made me remember my own experience with Osho, who at that time was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. And to your point, Raffaello, I was just a student at Cambridge University. I was just digging into my PhD. I was focused, linear, rational, and there was a dean of Churchill College. He was the chaplain. And I met him one day, and he was completely opposite of everybody that I was interacting with at Cambridge. He was alive. He was funny. He was very charismatic, and he probably took pity on this poor doctoral student who was living on, halfpenny a day. I was one of these starving students, and he invited me over to his house. He says, "Have you ever heard of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh?" And I never had. He says, "Come over to my house on Tuesday nights. We have this gathering, and we just listened to one of his lectures." And I can still remember, we went again in a room, and there was cushions around, and I was a little uncomfortable with just sitting on the floor with cushions at that time. So I sat on the cushion, and we were quiet for a while, and then all of a sudden, Bhagwan's voice came on. And I can still remember the sensation I felt immediately, almost like drained of energy at one level. And it felt as if someone was taking all my clothes off. And I just relaxed into an hour, 75-minute discourse. And I'd never had an experience like that before in my life, where words somehow went all the way through my being with such a eloquence and a profundity that I was immediately enraptured. So I kept going back week after week after week. Next thing we know, we were doing these dynamic meditations in the little meditation center I was curating, and so forth and so on. So to your point, Yanjun, there's the existential effect of Osho was very profound on people. And especially, I would say, his words, the way he would speak was completely mesmerizing.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I can relate to that. And I just want to say that some of that magic is preserved in the book. This is why I really encourage, in most Osho books, I would say, because of this choice to just transcript his speech without too much editing. I love that it hasn't been edited to what we would consider today's editorial standards. So particularly in the Book of Secrets, it is like listening to someone speaking. And to your point of aliveness and humor, I've had so many laughs just reading this book, and somehow there is a particular kind of and there is a particular kind of spiritual humor. I don't know if you can relate to this word, where a joke or a humor or a humorous story, like some of the Zen stories can be very humorous, opens us up or lets something fall away into a realization. Then we're laughing at the cosmic joke of it all. So there's plenty of that in this.
Yanjun, do you have any further comment?
Thank you. It's so beautiful for your story. I love it.
Well, I think I would like to address two issues, Raffaello. One, I hadn't taken in that he had a sort of a systematic critique of Gandhi. And I don't know how much you know about that, but I think given how Gandhi is revered, I would be very interesting in Osho's critique of Gandhi. And then the other thing that I'd like to have you comment on, which touches on the point that I was making about the fiery nature of Tantra, and why most traditions handle it with care, if they allow it at all, is the way that Osho himself exploded at the end. And he was thrown out of India, as you all know, because Pune became just a hotbed of sexual, emotional, revolutionary fervor that challenged and alienated the conventional lifestyle of India, during that time. And then he moved to Antelope, Oregon, and ended up in a huge, catastrophic implosion a few years later, from which the community, and then he himself died shortly thereafter. So I wonder, starting with Gandhi, for you to comment on how Osho ended up historically, and what do you think that means about the spirituality that he was teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and a sensitive subject, I understand. So Osho, I think you could sum it up by saying that Osho considered and declared publicly a few times Gandhi to be fundamentally a hypocrite. But we need to understand what Osho was interested in at that time and what his value system was. He was very, very critical of saints of any kind, because he basically said, if you, to turn a living human into a saint, you need to violently repress one half of that person. Osho spoke about Zorba the Buddha, right? So he loved these paradoxes where he said, look, like a human being is both a Buddha in potential and a Zorba in potential. So it's both like an ascetic saint and a depraved libertine, if you will. And so he had a natural antipathy for anybody who would present themselves as a saint. And somehow Gandhi matched that. Particularly then, Osho honed into the non-violence aspect of Gandhi's teaching. As you can imagine, that was kind of like one of the most prominent features of Gandhi, embodied action and thought. And he used to say some very controversial things, even if I'm not mistaken, even comparing Gandhi to Hitler. He loved, to make this kind of épate les bourgeois declarations that would shock everybody. But basically, he was saying, look, Hitler was clearly a violent man and a mass murderer. But don't you think that Gandhi is a non-violent man? There is violence in his speech and in his actions, but he just will not declare that openly. So that was a provocative, and who knows actually, what his real motivations were, but from Osho's passion for embracing the dark and the light side, which is a very tantric principle, you could see how Gandhi wasn't that. And not just Gandhi, but what the collective consciousness made of Gandhi, because of course Gandhi was a human being, but what the symbol that was made out of it, of this perfectly saint man, which we know nowadays to not be a factual truth. And there's a lot of explorations about, for example, Gandhi's racism for his time in South Africa. But Osho, I believe, was very bent on breaking this habit of turning people into saints. And I would say that and he felt that there was a terrible hypocrisy in that. And that if someone encouraged that onto themselves, then they were hypocrites. So I think that's the root, the kernel of what Osho's critique of Gandhi contained, and Yeah, I would leave it at that for the moment. To your second point,
Yanjun, did you want to make a comment?
Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, yes. I heard some about Osho's way to deal with addiction. It's not like, renounce. In fact, they just let them, if you want to smoke, just smoke until you feel tired and just quit suddenly. But with full awareness, with consciousness, they smoking to deal with addiction. Similar like about sexuality, this kind of things.
Yeah, that's a great point. So to your second point first, like, isn't there, good reasons to keep these tantric teaching very, very sort of like protected and almost in a sealed box? Because it could seem to be that as soon as they're out in the open, they end up creating mayhem, and isn't the Pune ashram and what happened in the Oregon community a proof of that? I understand that point. However, we could say, well, look, the other spiritual paths, also like the so-called, like the ascetic spiritual paths, like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhist, perhaps to a lesser extent, they've also created incredible amount of suffering and violence in the world and wars. So therefore, it is not so much about the teaching itself, but it's about the nature of humanity that is able to convert anything really into a murderous philosophy. The example of socialism is also a good one. Anything that was conceived with a genuine desire to support humans in recognizing themselves and being whole can go that way. So I don't know that that argument cannot be turned into the same spiritual doctrines that often bring it up. And then to the second point, well, not to the second point, but just to deepen a little more into that, I do think, however, that there is a grain of truth in what you say, which is the risk with tantric teachings is to take them as, oh, wow, amazing. Like, here is a spiritual path that tells me, you know what, if you want to know God, you don't need to make any efforts. You're good as you are. You're perfect as you are. Just be yourself and let go into any form of whatever impulses, addictions, which touches onto also Yangjun's point. And it's kind of understandable to confuse Tantra with that, but that is not what Tantra is, because there is an element that people very conveniently forget. When they say, oh, but Tantra says that, drinking is okay and meat is okay and sex is okay. Those are the 5 M's from classical Tantra, that provoke the Brahmin so much, because the Tantric said, yeah, you can have grain and meat and sex and alcohol, but what's very convenient to forget is that, yes, all of that, but with awareness, with total and full awareness. And I would argue that, well, that's a very tough spiritual practice. Like, try to be in the midst of your deepest addiction, whatever that is.
Very tough.
And breathing, and breathing fluidly and in sharp and clear awareness. So that's when it's not that easy as some people may make it seem. And I would argue that all of what you shared, all the tribulations that happened in tantric communities, including in the Osho communities, were the clear result of lack of awareness and of the incapability of most humans to maintain awareness in the midst of intense situations and emotions and all of that. So then we could say, okay, so isn't it best to just create an environment that is very devoid of any stimuli, like many monasteries have been? Yes, but that has also shown to not always work in placating the inner turmoil of the humans that inhabit those monasteries. So what do we do? You know, like it's like a bull that can't be simply explained away. It needs to be held by the horns.
Mhm.
And that's why some people will say that the practice of Tantra is like riding a tiger. Like you're not running away from the tiger, but you're also not letting yourself be devoured by the tiger. The tiger is the passions and the instincts. You're riding the tiger.
Yeah, you know, back to Jan Jun's point about smoking and, you know, even drinking, the reality of drinking, if you enter drinking alcohol, the more you drink, the more you lose your capacity for awareness. And that is why some of the great masters said, just leave it alone, because you're simply not strong enough to be able to drink without getting drunk. It is just for, you know, 99.999% of the people, their will, their consciousness is not sufficient for that task. They can barely just sit quietly and be aware of their own breathing. Remember, the Buddha said, just breathe, just be aware of your own breathing. Most of us, if we sat and took 100 people and said, just breathe, follow your breath for 1 minute, 90% of them couldn't follow their breath for even 1 minute, let alone have a tantric experience with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know, Tantra is a very tall order, I think is the point. And it needs to be handled with deep caution and control. And it's worth just touching on that the original both Hindu and Buddhist Tantra was sitting in the graveyards, sitting beside a corpse. So it's not, we associate Tantra with sort of sex and sort of a libertine exploration of the senses. But the original strata was very tentatively exploring that realm within, as you say, carefully confined conditions in which awareness was accentuated and the experience was integrated into awareness rather than limited awareness just entering into the sense world, as most people interact with alcohol and then end up inebriated. So Tantra is a very exquisitely high art form. Would you agree with that?
Totally. The one extra comment that I would make is that, you know, when you said for 99% of the people, that was actually exactly, you know, the way that some of the tantric teachings were held, of like, this is okay for a very small minority of the practitioners. However, at the same time, the Hindu philosophy also always recognized that humanity changes. And you can see that, for example, in the teaching about the yugas, about the different yugas, the different eras that humanity goes through.
Mm-hmm.
And Tantra was considered to be the teaching for the majority of the population, actually, for the majority of people, once Kali Yuga was entered. So somehow, you know, we also need to recognize, and that's not, by the way, because of a great advancement, a spiritual advancement, but maybe because of the opposite, because there is a moment in time when people need to be given doorways of access to spirituality that they can actually walk through, you know, because otherwise, if the teaching doesn't meet the humanity, then there isn't a transmission there. So somehow there is a question, and I don't have the answer but there is a question whether this kind of widespread resurgence of not just tantric teachings, but also Taoist teachings and embodied forms of yoga. Remember that, you know, when we now associate yoga with like doing all kinds of postures, that would just be one particular branch of yoga, the Hatha yoga, but actually many forms of yoga that had nothing to do with the body. However, today, the mass popularization of the more embodied forms of spiritualities and forms of spirituality that include emotions and include sexuality might respond to a humanity that is now hungry for these kind of teachings, that doesn't eliminate the risks, but that could transform what used to be a very specific and select transmission for certain people
Yeah.
into something that is actually more for the masses. And it's a question. I'm not saying that as a statement to agree with, but as a question to consider.
Yeah. Well, Raffaello, thank you so much. And Yanjun, thank you. You brought in some very important points for consideration. So I want to appreciate you too. And that will bring us to a close for today, everyone. But then 1 month from today, on the second Tuesday of June, Raffaello will be back for his final discourse on one of the great spiritual masters of our time, I would say. I think Osho really opened up the mysticism and the spirituality of India to the West in a very profound way that will be remembered as one of the milestones of modern spiritual development. So Raffaello, thank you for choosing that book. And
thank you, Jim, for inviting me.
All right, everyone, that'll do it for us for today. We'll see you next month in June on the second Tuesday. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Yanjun.